now I'm a little sheepish about my title, so I apologize. But I took Misha's questions to heart, mainly tackling the central question about, is there a way that we think about evaluation that we could think of as sort of a Judith model of evaluation? And then in the process, I'm going to be talking about some of the influences of what I think is a model on my own work, and also addressing a little bit of the question is there something about, what about evaluations, an evaluation can lead to learning? And so, if I can get this thing to work. Here we go. So, I mean, we've been hearing the same things over and over all morning, and actually from the research perspective, and I think it's actually how I think about the contribution to my work and to evaluation is, really going out and actively looking for surprises, seeking them out, challenging received wisdom, not taking the immediate obvious answer as the right answer necessarily. Learning from successes, seeking them out. There's actually a discipline within the facilitation world called appreciative inquiry, which has a stepwise process of bringing groups through an inquiry of saying, give us examples of when things are working well. So collectively think about those moments, what they're like. What's going on in the environment during those moments, and how can we be intentional about creating those contexts more purposefully, so that we can have that, generate the conditions of those successes happening in the future. And it's a technique that I incorporate in a lot of my facilitation work, but I also am beginning to incorporate pretty intentionally in my evaluative work as well. And then comparing across cases, and here it goes a little bit to the question about how do you draw out lessons how do you draw out that generalizable lessons across various cases? And I mean, I do think that the answer for that goes to the observation about Judith being an acute observer, and then really asking us each to be acute observers of what's happening and what we're seeing in reality, and pushing us to go to the field and asking a lot of questions and being there. And in that process of careful observation is when those insights come out. And I know that that's the scariest moment, when you have a lot of data and you've done all this research and you're like, okay, now I'm supposed to come up with the really brilliant insight of that generalizable lesson that runs across all the cases that I'm looking at. And it's not always immediately obvious. And so I think that there isn't I guess my insight on that is that there isn't a formula for it, other than being a careful observer and trusting that by sitting with the data for long enough, some insights will emerge in that. And so this is the last lesson from what I think of as the Judith model, which is sitting with the data. A lot of times, what we're looking at is very complex and doesn't seem to make sense, and we graph it out, and it really isn't making a lot of sense initially. But as we sit with it, often the patterns will emerge. We're coming at it, and I think what Judith asks us to do is come at it not with a model of how things are supposed to be looking, but to use an inductive process of saying what is the process that's unfolding in front of us, and what can we learn from that. And then the most powerful piece of advice I think that I got out of Judith is, when you're stumped for like that next question to ask in an interview, just ask why. Why? Why did you do that? Well, what led you to do that when you could have been doing this? Or, what did you think about this, at the moment that it was going on? Why? And that why question, is so powerful, because it brings up the stories about, 10 years ago we had this thing going on, and we learned then, and then you start uncovering all the history and all the context and all the structure that is behind a pattern that's emerging. And so I wanted to talk about sort of two things in my own practice and how this has played out in my own practice. The first is the work that I'm doing with Oxfam and the policy advocacy work that Oxfam does. My role is an internal consultant, if you will. I work with campaign teams who are trying to influence government policies around different issues. And I'm helping them do their own monitoring and evaluation and learning. And actually, the term that we use is MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as opposed to M&E. And the idea there is very intentionally that the learning is part of the practice. It's not something that happens afterwards or might happen accidentally, but you're trying to be very intentional about it. And what's different and challenging about campaigns and trying to build evaluative systems and learning systems around campaigns is that they move at a clip that's incredibly fast-paced. There's a high degree of uncertainty and unpredictability about when legislation might be introduced, about who the political players are going to be, what stance they're going to take. There's a lot of unknowns in the field as you're going into trying to influence public policy. Usually those windows of opportunities or the blocks to opportunity happen as surprises. So surprise is sort of a nature of the environment that you're working in, and it's all happening very, very quickly. And activists that have no time to stop and document and think and reflect and do all the nice things that evaluators might want them to do. So it's a challenge as an evaluator to come in and say, oh, well, let's take a 3-day break now and have some evaluation and learning. They just don't. They'll sit there with their BlackBerries and they go, they get very anxious. They don't want to spend that much time. So one of the things that I've developed in the systems that I've been building with Oxfam is that they're very much focused on providing real-time feedback to the teams. They're team-based in the sense that it's not me coming in and presenting data and findings to the team, but the inductive process is actually carried out with and by the team, so that there's a sense-making process that the teams themselves are going through that is tied directly into their own strategic analysis and real-time adjustment. So they're adjusting their strategies in response to the evaluative work that we're doing. And good enough data, so knowing when enough data is good enough to make an informed decision on. And so a couple of things, and there are a number of layers of the system that we've been building: external evaluations coupled with internal evaluations, coupled with some real-time after-event debriefing, coupled with performing some really short-cycle performance measurement systems. So we're doing a couple different levels of it. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about is some insights about the system that I think really build on insights from Judith's work. Because fundamentally what we're talking about is a context of complexity. Campaigns by their nature are complex. The emergent nature, there's a non-linearity to them. You don't know when a breakthrough is going to happen. Some small thing could trigger a very large shift in the external context and completely change the opportunity structure. And that kind of non-linearity and emergence requires, by nature, an open-ended inquiry model. So you can't really go in with, here's the framework and these are the indicators that we're going to be looking at, because those are going to tell us if we met with success or not. You actually, by its nature, need to be taking an open-ended approach. And in fact, the right approach is for campaigners and evaluators who are supporting them to be sensing, reacting, measuring, and then adapting. Sensing, reacting, measuring the effects of that reaction, and then adapting to what they're learning from that measurement. It's very different from what we think about usual planning and evaluation. When you plan, you do, you measure, and then you judge. And there the model is how closely did I conform with the model of my intervention as I initially conceived it, right? It's a fidelity model, right? I plan it, I do it, I measure the effectiveness, and then I judge what's the fidelity of my application. With campaigning, the sense, react, measure, and adjust, what we're really trying to assess is what's the adaptive capacity in light of our strategic intent. And we have a strategic intent, but we know our strategy is going to change. It has to adapt to changes in the external environment. So it's a very different kind of evaluative question than what we usually think of in terms of project evaluation and how the evaluation field typically comes at evaluation. So I think for me, the sort of this open inquiry, adaptive model that Judith has imbued us all with was absolutely, thinking about campaigning evaluation, it just totally lent itself. It became a very intuitive kind of problem for me to solve in some ways. And we're still building the systems and working with it. The other piece of this that's important is that is the team-based sense-making piece of it. And this goes to the question about, what is it about evaluations that lead to them being useful and applied? And I guess I would want to sort of reframe that question a little bit in terms of in a sort of Judith-esque kind of way. What are the conditions that lead to learning? Because I think it's less about the evaluation itself or the content, but rather the incentive structures around which evaluative information or empirical information is brought into a sense-making process, and who's a part of that sense-making process that leads to learning. So I think of my customers as being first and foremost the campaign teams, but I have to recognize that there's senior managers who are also customers of the evaluative data, that we have donors who are customers of our evaluative data. We have some evaluation systems that have been built specifically to service donor interests, which actually are less useful for teams. And so there's a real balance. But so for me, it's what are the conditions that lead to learning, and who's the learner? Who needs to learn in this context? And you have to be kind of purposeful about answering that question. So the second way in which Judith's work has affected my work is in how I think about structuring those conditions. And so this is the other big contribution where I try to be in the background, but to follow Judith's example of really getting people to look at the data in a careful way, and that's why I think of Judith's green pen as being that pushing us to be very purposeful and very careful in our observations, asking why, but really mostly in my practice it's asking advocates or practitioners to ask why. Why is this working? Why isn't this working? What's going on? And to create a safe space for that. And I think that if there's anything that, for me, is a hallmark of Judith's work with all of us, it's that she has really created a safe space for us to explore and learn. And if we can do some measure of that in our professional lives, I think we'll have done honor to that model.